All right, we're in. Happy to see everybody waiting. As you know, I'm EJ Snyder. That guy over there, I actually pointed the right way this time, is Arjun Menon from PFF. And we're here to talk about QBS and QBDD, the stat we launched a couple of days ago, quarterback support and quarterback difficulty differential. Arjun, how you doing? I know you still got class schedule going on. I'm starting draft season. Like, you just hanging on?
Yeah, hanging on. It's about less than 2 weeks to my midterms, and then another week till spring break. So just really trying to power through to that third week and go from there.
Yeah, it's a busy time of year all the way around. We didn't think through that part. Had the genesis of this idea at like 5 a.m. one morning. Rolled over and said, I think we can quantify that. I reached out to our mutual friend Brad Spielberger and said, "Do you think I'm crazy? And if not, do you think there's anybody that would go on this silly ride with me?" And I was actually really hoping he'd say Arjun. He did. He connected Arjun and I. We talked through it. We thought we could take a shot at this. We didn't realize it was going to take quite so long, but we launched it. And honestly, I was telling Arjun earlier today that if we had gotten 100,000 people that looked at it or 200,000, I would have been like, man, that's great. As it turns out, 500,000 of you have looked at this so far. So yeah, there's a little bit of interest. I imagine folks are going to join in, ask questions, but we knew we wanted to have a session to talk through it. This is not a simple stat. This is not a one and done kind of a thing. It's organic, and we've already made some upgrades. We're going to introduce those as well. But before we kick off, anything you want to start off with, Arjun, about this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was a fun process. I know we went back and forth on it, and I'm glad we were able to get it out before the Super Bowl, and I think the overall reception was pretty positive. Like obviously with any metric, it's not always going to be 100%. Everyone agrees with it, which is fine. Like there should be some pushback, and I'm happy to talk through things with anyone or talk about any rankings or the methodology behind it. So that's why we're here. That's why we're going live. So excited for this next hour and to see what we get out of it.
Yeah, we'll play with it. Again, we've already made some upgrades based on feedback from everybody in the comments. Again, there was a lot of that. I think probably a lot more than either one of us was expecting, which is awesome. It means that what we set out to do, which was start a conversation, has occurred. We sort of lit the fuse and let it go in the world, and now we'll talk through the rest of it. But basically, what we're going to do for this hour is talk about the visual upgrades first. Then we're going to talk through some of the frequently asked questions that came up a lot in the comments, common refrains that we hope we can answer for everybody. Then we'll have an open question session, answer as many of those as we can in the remaining probably 40, 45 minutes, and talk about next steps, see what those are, and go from there. So thanks for being here. We'll start off with visual upgrades. A lot of folks were confused, and rightfully so, by the way the graphs were laid out. And I understand that. And we also worked, we should say, with Alex Katzen to develop the QBDD graph. Everything else Arjun developed. So thanks to him for all those visuals. But one thing that a lot of people had problems with or had trouble understanding, I think is just an easier way to say it, was the way that it was laid out originally. And this is the original graph where we had the QB headshot over what is QBS, and the EPA was the point of the comet tail. And a lot of people rightfully said, hey, why isn't the picture of the QB on EPA? Because that's what they earned. And why don't we have some other marker for QBS? And I'm here to tell you, all of you were right. That decision was made late at night by me, not rightfully so. As soon as somebody said it, I was like, that makes a ton more sense. Reached out to Alex, and he made us a new version of this graph, which is this one. So data is exactly the same. Rankings are exactly the same. But now the quarterback headshot is over their EPA per play. The team logo is QBS, or quarterback support, which makes sense. And the other thing we did was reverse the sort of comet tail direction. So you can think of it as a quarterback's EPA pulling away from QBS, either pulling it up or pulling it down. And again, those relationships are the same as they were in this original graph. I just think it's a little bit easier to read. How's that land with you, Arjun?
Yeah, I agree. And again, this is great feedback from people. I think like looking at the quarterbacks you want to see, like realistically, if they're good, you see their faces to the right, they're outperforming expectations. So yeah, I agree with this. I think this is a nicer way of putting it. I also like that Alex added the logo on the left, just so we could that would be like the team and the quarterback is representation of themselves. So really like that upgrade. I think that was a really good move, and I think it looks much better now.
The only guy that doesn't like this is Derek Carr because now he gets to wear a Jaguar on his face because he just likes to party, I guess. But anyways, we hope that clears that piece up visually from now on when we release QBDD, whenever that is, at whatever interval that is. We'll be releasing this graphic because I think it's a lot easier to understand sort of initially just at face value. But that came from you all because you said, hey, this is the way that I see it. One of the great things people have asked me is, what have you learned from this process or from releasing this stat? The one thing I learned is that my brain visually does not work like everybody else's. And that's awesome. I'm happy to do it for the majority to make it easier to understand. Cause that's what we really want to do is make the data accessible as we can to as many people as we can. All right, so that's it for visual upgrades. I am going to stop sharing that sucker, and we are going to go to some frequently asked questions, which we got a lot. I'm already seeing some of those pop up in the comments tonight as well. One thing was missing quarterbacks, and we should talk about this. Arjun, do you want to talk about the relationship between QBS, which is the team-centric metric, and EPA, which is the quarterback-centric metric?
Yeah, so I know there were some requests for like adding other quarterbacks, seeing where their QBDD is, and one of the reasons I didn't include like so the methodology really was I was only looking at the quarterbacks who had the most games started for their respective team, just because I thought they would have had the most games with that specific support. Plus, the table already at 32 players is kind of long, and I didn't want to make it any longer. And obviously, like I would love to, include as many players as I can. But in this case, I didn't think it was really necessary. And I guess to the second part, yeah, the EPA is representative of that specific quarterback. The overall team composite score is the season long composite score for the team. The quarterback's EPA is reflective of only the games that they started or the plays that they were involved in. So Joe Burrow's QBDD was only the weeks that he was playing. It didn't include the Jake Browning. His EPA didn't include Jake Browning's EPA, but the overall composite score did include the weeks that Jake Browning was starting. So I hope that clears some of the things up. I know there were questions like, oh, like is this did the team improved when this quarterback took over? They had better pass blocking or their rushing game improved. But that, a lot of the stats we used were season long, and the QB EPA was reflective of just the QB.
Now, so a lot of the quarterbacks we got questions about, Kyler Murray, Browning, were smaller sample starters. And to be able to parse that out is very difficult because a lot of times they come in the middle of the game. Same thing with like Anthony Richardson, coming in or going out or doing both for the Colts in the first month of the season. Trying to pull that all apart isn't feasible for us. Another question we got. So I hope that clears up why some of those starters aren't in there. Yes, we could put those starters EPAs up there. Again, the QBDD would change only because the quarterback EPA changed. The QBS score would remain the same because it's for the entire team for the entire year. The other thing is with smaller sample sizes, and we had this happen with Joe Flacco. We did these, just so you all know, every week from week 9 on. I had this idea in about week 7, about week 8. I reached out. We started talking. Week 9 was the first week that we ran all the numbers we could to see what worked and whether or not the mechanics were returning the results that we thought we should see. When Flacco started playing at the end of the season for the Browns, he had a really good month. He was hot for 3 or 4 weeks. And then his last 2 weeks, the wheels fell off and he threw a bunch of backbreaking interceptions and his EPA tanked. And because his overall sample size was only 6 games, it really hurt him. He went from being positive, 3 weeks into his starting tenure to being pretty harshly negative in the last graph. because small sample size, bunch of backbreaking picks in the last couple of weeks, and not a big sample size to sort of put those against. So they basically counted for a bigger percentage of his overall result. So that's one thing. Somebody else asked, can you do this for college quarterbacks? And I thought, well, mechanically, I think we can. Talking through with Arjun, no, we can't, because one of the stats we used in the original table, which is the perfectly covered stat, they don't record for colleges. So we can't just plug it in, and recreating it would take a ton of work. I too think it would be really interesting to take the top, say, 8 draft eligible quarterbacks on most people's boards, run this number for them, and see. There are some significant differences in college about those numbers, but the biggest one is a key component. One of the 5 stats we use to calculate QBS just isn't there. So that's an answer to that one. Another very common question: how far back can you run this data? Can you run this, decades and decades and see if it's statistically viable? The answer is, again, one of the stats we are using as a sort of tentpole, one of the 5 major stats for QBS, only goes back to 2019. So we could run this back to 2019 for all quarterbacks, or the majority of starting quarterbacks. We cannot run it back decades and decades and see how it stacks up. We can run it going forward and, again, make changes. That's the best way we're going to see statistical viability.
Yeah, and going off of that, yeah. So the data that I used for the perfectly covered play rate to measure scheme and receivers, that data from PFF is only available back to 2019, which is when they first started charting it. And so that's why we can only go back to 2019. It's also only available for the NFL, just because the sheer volume of analysts and data collectors that it would take to do that for every single team in the NCAA, I just don't think it's feasible. And I also just don't know if there's a market for it. I don't know if NFL teams or NCAA teams would want to use that data. So it's all about feasibility, like EJ said. And I think even just going from 2019 to 2023, that's 5 years of data. Like that's not a lot of data. It's only 5 times 32 teams, so that's like 160 sample size. But it is possible. So if you are curious, I can start looking at previous years to see where teams ranked or where teams stacked up, and the QBDD for other QBs in the past.
Another really common question we got was, did doing this highlight or sort of surprised you, pull out any players either positively or negatively as you went through the process? I'll go and say that, Flacco was a really interesting case study, again, because of that small sample size. And we got to see how reflective certain pieces that really reflect a quarterback's EPA. Again, EPA per play is not a stat we made up. That's an established quarterback metric. And we thought that was important to use. But watching the sort of significance of a shorter sample size, everything, whether they're touchdowns or interceptions or first downs or whatever else, meaning so much more because there's so many fewer of them. That was a fascinating one to me. Baker being at the top was very interesting. I think that passed the eye test. He played very well under Dave Canales. It's the reason that Canales is now the head coach of the Panthers. Jordan Love was surprising to me and extremely painful as a Bears fan to see that. Yes, again, when we started running this, he was a fascinating watch because it was week 9. He was just starting to go on his run for the first 6 to 7 weeks, not including the Bears game, because look, the week 1 Bears were hardly worth playing as a defense, but the Packers and Matt LaFleur struggled for the first 6 to 7 weeks. They were not, quote unquote, on track. And then Jordan Love got cooking right about the time we started doing this. So his tail was much shorter when we started doing this. And each week we did it, it got longer and longer, and he got better and better. And we saw that on the field. We saw that reflected. And as painful as that is, it is representative. So that was one for me. Herbert and Burrow, obviously, we're going to get a lot of lightning rods around Purdy, and we can talk about that. Obviously, he's in the Super Bowl, and there's been, I would say, too much talk about Purdy as a player as opposed to all of San Francisco. And then folks at the bottom, Mac Jones, Desmond Ridder, I think those are probably the ones that stuck out for me. Anybody really that you thought was fascinating for one reason or another, good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, you brought it up. Baker, I think, was pretty surprising to me. I knew he played kind of above my expectations, but for him to be number 1 here, I thought that was a representation of how well he really played. We talk about, especially we just look at the Bucks offense. Like there was no run game. They had like an okay, I think, pass blocking grade. And then, Canales, I think he was okay. It wasn't like great in terms of scheming guys open. And, one thing that we didn't really account for was drops. And I think, at times watching the Bucks, Mike Evans had, I think, the worst drop rate of his career this year, or one of the worst. We saw it in multiple, especially in the Philly game. He dropped a really bad one. But yeah, I think Baker was one that really stood out to me. And on the bottom, I mean, yeah, like Mahomes being, that far negative, I think it was a little surprising just because, I think there's a lot of people who did talk about, his play overall may not have dropped off, but his efficiency did. And yeah, his efficiency is tied to some of the drops that, MVS or other guys have. But for him to be that low was a little surprising. Probably the only year that it's ever going to happen for him, unless he, gets hurt or plays on a really bad offense yet again. But those would be the two guys that really stood out. And I also think one guy, Dak, that he performed at expectation, given that he was number 2, I want to say, or the Cowboys were number 2 in QB support. I think that's really good for Dak. And, you can't really get much better. You can't really perform much better than number 2. And so shout out to Dak. I think, the final playoff game will leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, but he had a tremendous season outside of maybe a game or two.
Yeah, there's a very strong recency bias for a lot of this data. Mahomes is a guy you mentioned. And of course, Mahomes and the Chiefs have morphed into playoff Chief. Like the playoff Chiefs are not the regular season Chiefs. Like people forget that on Christmas in Kansas City, the Chiefs got beat by the Raiders. They only scored 14 points. Nobody was trumpeting that Mahomes had a great EPA per play at that point. He didn't. And the other thing that's fun about talking about Mahomes is here's a guy that finished 11th in one of the most competitive jobs in the world. Like Mahomes's EPA per play is 11th in the league. That's top third, right? Not many people in general in their chosen profession, especially not one as competitive as playing quarterback in the NFL, that rank in the top third are talked about as dragging their team down or failing. And I saw a lot of that in the comments, and I was like, he didn't live up to his normal standard, but he was still excellent. And yes, his team was better. That leads very well into one of the conversations that we had in the comments about why don't you make a QBDD that is the offensive number only, the second, with defense and special teams removed, the second to the last column in the first table that we put out in the tweet stream that launched this. I have reasons against that. So I'm the guy that came up with this, and thinking of QBDD, I really wanted a picture of overall support. And the questions I would ask people that want an offense only one is A, would the Chiefs have made the Super Bowl without their defense this year? And I think the answer to that one is flatly no. I think they would have lost too many games early in the year without Steve Spagnuolo keeping other teams' point totals low, so that when the receivers were dropping those and Mahomes wasn't being as efficient, they could still stay competitive in a bunch of those games and be in the position that they were at the end of the season. Second question I would ask, because a lot of people are using this stat, or at least the QBS portion of it, to say, how desirable is this landing spot for a rookie quarterback? And if you are going to put a rookie quarterback on a team, do you want a good defense or a bad one? Like, you want a good defense. That's an important piece of supporting a rookie quarterback. So again, removing defense from this stat from QBS, to me, really takes a lot of the efficacy out, makes it not as relatable, not as viable as a stat. Certainly in my mind. Special teams, not as much, but special teams isn't weighted as strongly as defense. And the last one is people saying, hey, look, quarterbacks and defense aren't on the field at the same time. Yes, I do know this, so that they're not related. And I say to that, that's flatly not true. And the evidence I would produce to say that is, if you're in a 5-point game, your offense probably stays the same. If you're in a 10-point game, your offense probably changes a little bit. If you're getting blown out by 2 scores, if it's a 15 or 17-point game, you're not playing the same offense. You're asking your quarterback to do other things. You're going to start abandoning the run. You're going to do more passes into tighter coverage. You're going to look for bigger chunks. You're going to go faster. All those things affect your quarterback's EPA, and they're based on your defense giving up a boatload of points. So the two stats are linked, even though, yes, they do not occupy the field at the same time, but it is a piece that I think is really important. So at this point, probably not going to release an offense only QBDD because I think that's really half a stat. And quite frankly, I think a lot of people are just going to grab that and try and beat other people over the head with it, that their quarterback is good or their quarterback is bad. And that's not really what we're doing here. We're trying to paint a comprehensive picture so people can look at the data and make their own assumptions, conclusions about that data based on what they see and how it is relative. And that was the whole point, is to rank the entire league in a system that was uniform, treated everybody the same, and you could just see what the numbers say. So probably won't be releasing offense only. Matthew Brown says, did y'all release a new chart? Yeah, Matthew was a little bit late to the program, so I will share one more time just so he and anybody else that joined a little bit later can see the new chart. We have not put it out on Twitter. We will do that after this stream. But this is the new chart. So this is the original chart that we launched on Tuesday. Yes, there was a lot of confusion about that. This is the new chart. The major changes are headshots now represent EPA, not QBS. Team logos represent QBS. And we did reverse the direction of the comment. So EPA is really pulling away from either above or below the QBS number. But hopefully that clears up a lot of the questions that many folks had about the visual representation of the original data set. Again, we'll pop this out on Twitter after we get done with the live stream. But yes, indeed, we did make a new chart. Well, our buddy Alex Katzen made a new chart.
Yeah,
quite frankly.
Shout out Alex.
Yeah, big shout out to Alex. He's like casually like, oh yeah, by the way, I know R. Classic Alex coming off the top rope, real subtle. But he was super helpful in the QBDD graph. The rest of everything, every other piece of data that you've seen represented visually was Arjun's work. Can't thank him enough for all that. It looks so good. And I think lends quite frankly a lot of credibility and puts it out there. A lot of people said there was a lot of subjectivity in this stat, which I found fascinating, because the only thing that you can really say is subjective is the passing grades, or the pass protection. Yeah, pass pro. Everything else is a straight stat. QBA EPA per play is based on numbers, rush EPA numbers, defense EPA numbers.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a little funny that people thought that it was, mushy, or that we were just making stuff up. The whole point of that original chart, including all the weights on the bottom and everything, is literally you can recreate that. These are all publicly available stats, and you can go and grab them for, whoever or whenever you want when they're available, weight them properly, put them through the multiplication. There's no behind the curtain stuff here. This is everything released. That's why we're doing this Q&A session, is to talk about methodology and be as clear as we can about where we got this data, why we chose this data, how we think it matches up, why we think it's important, and just letting everybody sort of, react whether or not they agree with that or not. That's fine. That, again, starts a conversation. And somebody asked me, hey, what happens if somebody takes this and wants to modify it and go down the rabbit hole on things like pass protection or personnel in a different way? And I'm like, cool, label it as modified and go for it. That's fascinating to me. I hope it happens. So
yeah.
Other than that, you got anything before we dive into all the questions folks are putting in comments?
Yeah, I think one of the things I kind of thought of as we released it could be cool to talk about the difference in the overall composite score with the offensive composite score, to see like, oh, this guy had like a much better offensive support, but once you factor in the other two sides of football, special teams and defense, they were brought down. Or this team had a really bad offensive support, but they had really good defensive and, to an extent, special team support. I thought that was kind of cool to look at. So for example, like guys that had like maybe bad offensive support but good support elsewhere. Derek Carr, 32nd percentile offensive support, but 64th percentile QB support. Aiden O'Connell, 39th percentile offensive support, 58th percentile QB support. Trevor Lawrence, 29th percentile offensive support, and 52nd percentile overall support. And so, like, for me, I like Trevor Lawrence. I think he's a good quarterback. I kind of thought he was a little underwhelming looking at the numbers now. And like, maybe I didn't fully take into account how his, not bad his situation was, but how tricky his offensive support was. Cause that was something that, without Christian Kirk, and then they did have some drop problems, I think, throughout the year. And I think it's cool to kind of see that play out in the data, that it kind of matches up with guys like Nate Tice, what Robert Mays they're saying on their podcast. And I think the fact that we can kind of see that in the data, and the fact that he had like a pretty solid defense, a pretty solid special teams to kind of boost his overall support, I think those kind of things were interesting to look at, after you posted it.
It was one of my favorite things about this entire process is you'd send me the data on like Tuesday every week, and I would pop it open as soon as I could and like look at who'd moved and things that my eye didn't agree with right away. Like, how is he really that bad, or is he really that good? And then I would dig into why it had moved, again, going back to the chart. Okay, where's that support? What's pushing him up? What's pushing him down? And I think what it did for me was remove a lot of the emotional response from Sundays, out of, oh, that guy, he got shortchanged, or, oh, he was just, he's riding the coattails of, his running back or whatever else. I could sort of flush that, look at the individual columns and go, okay, he is getting really good support that I thought he was. He's not performing at the level that I expected. And those conversations in my own head were great. They were great for my analysis. They definitely affected the stuff that I was able to talk about on Bootleg when we did our weekly recaps. They led to certainly using some data in previews saying, hey, this team's not what you think it is. Like, it's a lot of people had this expectation, including me, going into the season. We thought that X was going to happen. If you look at the data, that is not occurring. Like that's just not true. It might happen sometime, but they better hurry up because they're running out of time. So it became a very interesting part of just my football lexicon, because I was working with it and going through the numbers and comparing every week. And that was incredibly useful to me. So when people talk about what did you learn during this process, that's probably one of the biggest ones for me, is just checking my eye on the field with real numbers and saying, did I really see that? Or did I just see one big play and, think, oh, that's great, and then go back and that's not the case. So, all right. I think we can dive into some questions. There's a bunch rolling through the comments. Again, thanks everybody to being here. We got, crested at 350 or 70 people, which, again, if you told me that a bunch of people were going to, gather on a Thursday afternoon during Super Bowl week to talk about stats that happened during the season, I don't know that I would have believed you, but you're here, and I can't thank you all enough for engaging with this, for the interest, for retweeting it. I have never seen a like to bookmark ratio of my original tweet. There's like 1,200 likes on that tweet, and I think there's like 600 bookmarks, which to me just says, oh, look, we released something really dense that people were like, I'm gonna have to go back to that. I can't consume it all right now. But again, people saving it, sharing it, retweeting it, talking with their friends about it, sending it to other people saying, hey, I think you might think this is interesting. Just really, really appreciate all the support. It was a ton of work. It was a lot of fun, but it's really cool to see it sort of take on a life of its own when you put it out there in the football sphere and people start really using it. So, all right. Honors start at 9. Ty Kendall says, I'm not sure when they start. I know they're already filing into the auditorium if they haven't started already. Yeah. I'm excited about tonight's Pro Football Hall of Fame induction class. There's going to be some good news in there. So I'll just leave it at that. And folks that follow the team that I follow will probably be pretty happy. Any of the questions you see in the comments that you really want to hit, I'm going to scroll back up and see if anything really sticks out in terms of, oh yeah, I saw that question before. Somebody says, what positive things can I say about Luke Getzey's offense and his future with the Raiders? No comment. I hope it works better than it did in Chicago, and it might. To be fair, it might. We'll see. But if anybody saw JSN's comments about Shane Waldron, who is now the offensive coordinator going to Chicago, I think my comments might be similar. Are we live? Yeah, we're live. Okay, not gonna say anything about that. Let's see. What are some of the better ones? Is there a way to score the highest impact to QBS, like if it's heavily weighted by defense? That's interesting. O-line wide receivers. We did weight the columns. You can talk about weighting a little bit if you want to. Yeah. Might be a good one.
There's another question also at the bottom by Justin Linder talking about the weight. So I'll address that. Yeah. So when thinking about how to kind of come up with these weights, we did this. We looked at how it correlated with win percentage, and then how it correlated with EPA. But I think, again, from a broader perspective, like the goal of football is not to like maximize your EPA per play, it's like maximize wins. And so I think at the end of the day, the goal is to like what matters most to winning. And so when trying to look at QB support as a whole, I think using win percentage to see, oh, what matters more to helping this quarterback out. I think that's where we came up with the weights. And also I think looking at it anyway, the weights were really similar for EPA and win percentage. It wasn't like a big difference. I think the only thing is like special teams really had no value when it came to comparing special teams EPA with QB EPA. And so like we did want to factor that in a little bit, which is why we went with win percentage. But on a more basic level, it wasn't a huge difference in weighting with win percentage versus EPA.
And fans of bootleg, this is, an outside bootleg project. We'll definitely be talking about it on bootleg. But the bootleg, since we are on the bootleg channel, since this kind of grew logistically, that's why we're here today. If you watched our off-season series last summer, I came up with a different metric called power score. And that was made very late in the process. Like we were already like a few days away from recording the first episode, and I had another sort of 5 a.m. moment of like, wait a minute, what are the things that are important to being a good football team, and how do we quantify them? And we had a quick conversation about those. And then I whipped it up and did it for the first 10 or 12 teams so we could record those. And one thing we knew immediately was like, hey, this works. It does reflect what we're seeing on the field, but it should also be weighted because these 6 categories are not equal to winning. So hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Arjun will be helping us weight power score for this summer based on the work we did here in QBS to say, hey, these are the things that are most important. And that was a lot of the feedback we got for power score. And it was just because we didn't have time to do it. We knew it needed to be weighted, but we couldn't weight it in the time we had. So we knew we were going to add weighting this year, and we'll do that. And Arjun's going to be helping us out doing that, which is fantastic. Let's take another one. Oh, look at that. My good buddy Brandon's in the chat. Was on his podcast last night. Curious how the 3 giant QBs showed up within the season, since Tyrod, DeVito, and DJ all had a similar number of games. Again, basically, if you want to know the answer to that, you can just look at their EPA per play for the season, which is really readily accessible as a stat. DeVito is the one listed. But DJ and Tyrod have an EPA per play. And again, the QBS number is based on the team's performance for the entire season. So that part of the equation won't change. If you want to figure out what QBDD is, it would just be the difference between DeVito's EPA per play and Tyrod's EPA per play and DJ's EPA per play. So easy enough to do. I'm not going to do it while we're live because I'm not that fast with math. But this is a fun one. I'm not going to let you field that one.
Yeah. So actually, me and EJ kind of talked about this earlier today. Like with Zach Taylor, it's tricky to evaluate him, in my opinion, because I think the first 3 weeks you're kind of hampered by Burrow's injuries. You're calling a lot of quick game. You're calling a lot of things to get rid of the ball quick. So in the perfectly covered play faced column, which is the column we'd attribute the most to him and the receivers, he's kind of, his play calling is hampered, and he's calling plays that are most likely going to be covered because you're getting rid of the ball so quick. You're not allowing receivers to get open. Burrow's not really going through his progressions. He had one of the highest, I think, first read target shares or first read rate throwing rates in the entire league in the first couple of weeks. And then they kind of settled back in. And then what we kind of noticed is after the Burrow injury and with Drake Browning, they started pushing a lot more easy buttons. So started calling a lot more play action. They were going under center a little bit more, especially to run the ball, which was a huge issue. They never go under center for whatever reason with Burrow at the helm. And so if I had to give him like a PFF grade, I think I would probably give him like an 80. I think he did well with Browning. I mean, they beat the Jags just like 10-point underdogs on the road. While Browning is, I think he played admirably at times. I think Taylor also put him in advantageous situations. But the Bengals ranking low in perfectly covered play rate is not a 1 year thing. Like this has been going on for the past couple of years. A lot of the Bengals offense is, relying on Chase and Higgins to win one-on-one matchups, especially on the sideline. And a lot of it is Burrow having to be accurate. And, it's not that Chase and Higgins don't get open, but Burrow is able to throw them open. And, Higgins and Chase are probably two of the best one-on-one receivers. So it's a combination of everything. I think Taylor leans into his player strengths a lot. And I think with Browning, we did see, I did feel he was scheming guys open a little bit more than with Burrow. So I hope that answers your question. And that was a little bit long as well.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, these are the details that folks are here to sort of dig into, and this is what happens. The reason we ran this Q&A specifically 2 days after launch is to let everybody just sit with this and sleep on it and wake up and go, wait a minute, how did they do that? Why did they do that? Do I agree with that? Those are the kind of questions that only come up after 24 to 48 hours. They do not come up in first blush when everybody's looking at all this data, because it was a lot. We didn't start off to, somebody asked me, did you start off to do both of these? And no, we didn't. I started off to to build QBS, to say, hey, how can we quantify support? And it was spurred by all the conversations early in the season about Brock Purdy. And, it's so easy to play quarterback for Shanahan. What he's doing doesn't really count, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, all right, well, how do we quantify that? We know that Kyle's a good play caller. We know that, certain teams have strengths in personnel or their defense, but like, how can we do that? And that was the genesis of this whole thing. But I really just started out with QBS. And then as I got there, I was like, and then what? Once we have QBS, what can we do with that? What can we compare it to really see who's sort of stretching their legs, who's sort of leading or pulling their team along, who's pulling their team down, who, again, like Dak, is performing pretty much right on. And that became QBDD, which, again, is one of the reasons this was longer than we thought it might be. Brandon asks, will you and Brett be using these during the 2024 season preview series? Yes. A lot of people have mentioned that Brett's not here tonight, and, why is that, and whatever else. I did this on my own on purpose because Brett is awesome. And he was a little bit angry. I didn't tell him about this. I actually didn't even show him all this work until we were in Dallas at Shrine Bowl. And that was purposeful. I wanted it to be almost done before I showed him. And he was like, why didn't you show me earlier? I would have told everybody. And I was like, look, Brett, anything that you put out is yours, because he is very successful and has a very, what I would say, positive gravity. And I wanted to release this individually, which is why this isn't a bootleg branded stream and everything else. But as soon as I said it, he's like, all right, I get it. I'm not wild about it, but we're using these and we're going to promote it. I think this is awesome work. And I said, that's all fine. We'll do all that, but we're going to get it out there, have people have the conversation. And then, yes, we will be rolling it into the 2024 season previews, along with Arjun's waiting for Power Score. So lots of upgrades coming for the summer series, but holy crap, that seems a long ways away because we are just in the beginning of draft season. What else we got? Do you believe it could be used to tell you if you give this guy better weapons, he will improve? I.e., an example, Justin Fields. You can go either way on this one. I'm going to let Arjun speak to his thoughts on it because I know he has different ones than I do. There is Justin Fields I knew was going to be a flashpoint in this particular, because he's a flashpoint for everything. Let's be honest. I mean, if you are in the Chicago Twitter sphere or you're a Bears fan, you understand how charged that conversation still is at this moment. Again, it shows how his performance is relative to, again, a QBS score that improved pretty massively, even just in the time that we were tracking it from week 9 to week 17. In the beginning of this, the Bears QBS score would have been in the toilet because their defense was terrible. Their offense was like, everything was bad. So honestly, if Justin's EPA per play had held steady where it is right now, he would have been slightly positive, but the Bears basically passed him at the end of the season. The defense improved pretty rapidly. They were top, I think, 7 in DVOA, maybe top 5 in DVOA for defense overall by the end of the season. So that was a massive increase from especially the first month of the season. Justin's play improved slightly, but I would say probably as a Bears fan, not enough. If you're looking at where he ranks, which is just where his picture is for EPA, we're talking about 33rd percentile overall and basically top of the bottom third. And that's after 3 years. Now, yes, you can argue about supporting cast, and you should. You can argue about coaching changes, and you should. You can argue about scheme, and you should. But if that's the case, at some point you got to be the guy. If you look at CJ Stroud's support from this year, he got less support than Justin for the entire year and performed far better. Again, after basically following him at the same institution, you could say a lot about that. Quarterbacks are different. Don't scout the helmet, but young guys, even in bad situations, Herbert's another one, pop off. They play better than their support. They show you those flashes. Justin has shown flashes, but not consistently. If you look at his data for the last 3 years, this wasn't a particularly down year for him. This was, an average year or slightly better in some cases. So is that enough after 3 years? That's a decision that Ryan Poles and his staff are going to make. I think they're probably going to lean one particular way. We'll see. But it is an interesting question when you break apart the offense and the defense and say, again, are they one of those people that had a lot of support over here and not a lot of support over here? That would be a case for, yes, they need to add weapons and then see what this guy really has. I really feel like the Bears kind of did that this year, getting DJ Moore, and certainly the running back room was good enough to win in the NFL. Cole Kmet improved. Mooney wasn't great or whatever else, but does he need more weapons? I think all quarterbacks need more weapons. I thought about this the other night, Arjun, you might agree. I'm coming around to the sort of Ron Wolf for quarterbacks theory about wide receivers. Like Ron Wolf was famous for, I'm just going to draft a quarterback every year and see how it works out. At this point, I think pretty much like every GM in the NFL is like, I'm just going to draft another wide receiver because he can never have enough and guys will age out or contracts will, and receiver classes are so good and they make such a big difference that you're just going to draft one every year, whether you quote unquote need one or not.
Yeah, no, I think you highlighted it really well. Again, I think the main thing I want to highlight here is, as of right now, like I would say this is more of a descriptive metric. We're describing team support. In terms of its predictiveness, that's something obviously I want to look at. I think it's been a little bit of a busy time period for me, so I haven't gotten to like look at, how stable is this year over year? But like if we just think about it logically, like the NFL with all the injuries, with all the variants that it has, like it's not something I'm expecting to be like super stable. Again, like you could have a great support in 1 year, but then the next year, half your offensive line is out with injury, and then you drop dramatically in that department. And then because your offensive line is bad now, so your pass blocking grade goes down. Now you can't run the ball, so your rushing EPA goes down. So just like thinking about it like that, in terms of that predictiveness, I don't know how stable it's going to be. The other part to answer this question, I think it would be interesting to look at, like, if a quarterback does change teams and they go to a team with a higher support, does their EPA rise? I think Baker Mayfield's a great example of this. It's tricky because he played for the Panthers and he played for the Rams. And so I don't know which EPA I'd use. Probably the Panthers one because it's a larger sample. But just examples like that, I think would make sense. You could look at like Stafford when he went from Detroit to LA. I'm gonna assume that 2021 LA Rams team had a lot more support than the 2020 Detroit or 2019 Detroit. So I think thinking about it like that also, yeah, we can reasonably expect a quarterback to get better with more support. But that quarterback also has to be good. And I'm not saying Justin Fields is bad, but I think quarterback does matter a lot in the situation over the supporting cast.
And Nathaniel has an interesting question, which kind of dovetails onto this, which is what does it mean that there's only a 0.01 difference between the Bears' overall QBS and their offensive composite QBS? It means they were a very balanced team, that one side of their team, the offensive side versus the defensive special team side, was not wildly different. And there are teams where those numbers are quite different. And if we did run an offensive only QBS, you would see movement based on those. You would see guys that, were supported greatly by a dominating defense, had no offensive support, drop or rise greatly. Means the Bears are quite balanced. By the end of the year, that was a balanced team. And they got equal support from both the offensive side and the defensive side. Now, how good that support was, it was almost midline. Like it's 48th, 49th percentile. It is middle of the pack. So do you need to improve both sides of the ball? Sure. You do. You got a lot of good young players on defense. You're going to get some boost from that. Do they need some more pieces on defense? They do. And same thing. They've got some questions on offense, both, free agents leaving and just the classic, hey, we need more weapons all the time. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is, what are you doing at quarterback? So we will see. It will be a fascinating offseason for that. Where can I find these stats? Adam says they're on my Twitter. If you're on Twitter, scroll not too far back through my profile, you will see the launch thread where I pasted all these graphs in the full table of data from Arjun. He pasted that as well. So you can go to his Twitter if you'd like to. And then we had the quadrant graph. We had the QBS graph with the comma tails, which we've updated. And they are, as Arjun pointed out today, static. You're not going to get any more stats from this season. All those stats are booked. We're not going to do a Super Bowl update because we don't need to. So Adam, you can find them there. Check them out. They are not posted on any other website right now. This is people ask me if this was an officially like PFF sanctioned thing. I'm like, no, Arjun works for PFF and I work for Bootleg. Like, well, I own Bootleg, but same thing. This is just two guys getting together, talking ball and saying, hey, can we bring something to the conversation that isn't there, and working hard to make it happen and seeing what happens. Somebody said, did I hear that Brett can't keep secrets? No, that's not what you heard. Brett is actually exceptional at keeping secrets. There's lots of things he knows that I don't even get to know. But also lots of things he knows that he shared with me that nobody else ever heard, that either did or did not come to pass. So no, Brett can absolutely keep a secret.
I think one question that I've seen a couple times in just various forms, injuries, like, are we accounting for injuries? In a way, yes. Like, we're not specifically saying, oh, this was an injured team, but when you're injured, your stats and metrics are going to be worse probably across the board. So it's like we're not directly accounting for it, but it's inherently accounted for within each of the metrics. So yeah, if you're like the Giants who are last here, and yeah, Andrew Thomas missed a good majority of the season, like, yeah, and they had a couple other guys who went down to injury. Like, yeah, they're like almost dead last in pass blocking grades. So yeah, it is accounted for in some form, just because the stats will be depressed if they're an injured team.
Yeah, great question from Ken. We assumed that most people saw the launch on Twitter. If you didn't, and you're just happening in because you're a Bootleg subscriber or anything else, QBS stands for quarterback support. It's a new stat that Arjun and I launched on Tuesday. It basically tries to account for the overall team concept around you in terms of offensive support, defensive support, special teams, play calling, roster, everything else. And basically defines that as a number per team. So each team has a QBS score, a QBS ranking, and then QBDD stands for quarterback difficulty differential, and it's the difference between a quarterback's EPA per play and the team's QBS score. And that is reflected as a stretch, either positively or negatively. Played better than their support, played about at the same level, or played much worse than their support. So that's what QBDD and QBS are, two new stats that we hope add some context, some nuance. Always looking to add a little bit of nuance to the conversation. Definitely saw a lot of that. I was actually quite buoyed by the fact that a lot of people, when they read these stats, approached them with some nuance. There were, of course, folks that were like, my guy good, my guy bad, don't like, new numbers, which always kind of cracks me up. Or all stats are bad. I saw that one. I was like, okay. It gave me the thought that basically watching football is then reduced to the Army game we all played as kids. Like, I got you. No, you didn't. Okay. If there's no stats, where do you go from there? Like, that guy's good. No, he isn't. All right. The next thing you're going to talk about is probably a stat, even if it's a basic stat or an advanced stat. So it's really a way to sort of elevate the conversation about the game beyond that guy good. Okay. Could you do the same thing for RBs and other positions too? Well, they're included in QBS. They're not, we could swap their position with the quarterback, but fundamentally that presents some interesting data problems.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I think if you want to, I mean, I've done something kind of like this for running backs. So if you have like a rushing yards over expected model, like Next Gen Stats does or PFF does, if you're trying to like measure running back difficulty, you can take the average. You can basically just take their expected yards they're expected to gain on average on each carry. You can take it by team, you can do it by the runner. That's something I have access to. So if you are interested in that, you can like send me a message on Twitter. I should actually post a graph about that, but that would be a better, like with running backs, like I think they're not as influenced by their surroundings as quarterbacks are. So, I would just use like a model like that. Keep it a little bit simpler than doing 5 metrics.
Yeah, it's one of the things about this, and people ask us either why we didn't include more stats or use less stats. There is a logistical piece to this. They were all existing stats. That was one of our caveats as we started out. We were not going to create a stat to create another stat. And although people may say that's exactly what QBDD is, it's not really. We used QBS and took it and put it against an established metric, quarterback EPA per play. So it's a relational number. This is, QBDD is not a rank of who the best quarterback is. If we're using that, we're using EPA per play, and that's not our stat to talk about sort of quarterback success. It's a relational metric of how far they are apart, either positively or negatively, from the support they receive from the rest of their team. But we didn't want to like make up stats and then plug those in and use those as a pillar to create another stat. So try to stay away from that. And we also wanted to keep this fairly simple. We didn't want 19 stats that we were culling every week to try and create some overly complex mixture stew of support that nobody would really be able to understand without weeks of study. That was never our intention. Really interesting question about how would you differentiate between the high potential QBs performance with the support system they had, i.e. a Zach Wilson or Justin Fields type. That's fascinating. And I think the most basic way I can address that question is to say that I wouldn't, because I want to see how it comes out in the wash. This is not a judgment of potential, or they could do better. If there is a lacking of support that we see in QBS, i.e. if they had a crappy surrounding cast and somebody has tabbed them as a high potential, high performing QB and say, and this is a very classic argument, we've heard it for years in both, the New York market and Chicago. Hey, if things around them were better, if coaching was better, if supporting cast was better, if they had more weapons, if the blocking was better. And at some point, you got to see it. And that's a thing with young quarterbacks, is even young quarterbacks in bad spots. And this is a really good time to bring up Bryce Young, because Bryce Young is on this chart. He had a terrible supporting cast. I'm going to bring it up so everybody can see it because it's just easier that way. So Bryce Young is over here. And he had a terrible supporting cast, one of the lowest QBS scores in the entire league. I think second lowest QBS score after the Giants in the entire league. And he performed terribly. His EPA is, like not even 10 in terms of 10th percentile. But he did perform better than his support. And there were some flashes, not many. He had a terrible year. There is no sugarcoating that. But he performed slightly better than his terrible support, which is an interesting thing. And same thing, Kenny Pickett's down here. Again, slightly worse than his not great support. Less than 25, less than 25th percentile for the Steelers overall QBS. Pickett performed slightly worse, not a long tail going one way or another. So it is an interesting metric for potential. And when I think that really comes into play is arguments like Justin Herbert, right? His support was not great. The Chargers they underperformed. And I know you're a Chargers fan. I know this is painful, Arjun. They underperformed. Again, their QBS scores like 12th and a half percentile, like 13th percentile. And Justin's performance as a quarterback, even within that system, is well over 50th percentile. It's like 55. So I think when you're talking about potential, those are the quarterbacks you kind of want to circle and go, look at what this guy's doing with not a ton of help. And, Gino's in that category this year. Again, I think he was in that category last year as well. We didn't run the numbers for last year, but if I had to make a guess about Gino, it would be similar. CJ Stroud, certainly Jordan Love. Those guys are really interesting. And conversely, the guys on the bottom, like Desmond Ridder, who a lot of people have said, oh, if he had everything perfectly around him, he'd be just fine. Kraft probably says otherwise. He had 75th percentile support in terms of QBS. I need to not show that? There we go. Ritter's way down here at the bottom. He's actually just under.
Yeah.
Just under, but has a very long tail to the left. And I think that's where the potential comes into. But at some point, my thing with potential is you got to see it. If they have a terribly low support and they performed better than that, then yeah, there's an argument to, hey, draft and develop. Let's bring some free agents in. Let's build the team around them. They look like they've got something there. If they're a potentially or a perennially low performing quarterback, the NFL is a meritocracy at some point. You got to make plays. So, all right. Any other questions? We are getting up towards our hour. I know we both have to run off and do other things, but anything? Oh, we should probably talk about future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So neither Arjun or I brought this up or built this stat to be the Cupers of the flame for QBS or QBDD. Again, the formula is out there. Folks can look at it, modify it, say it's useful, say it's not useful, do whatever they need to do that. And, we can go from there. We, again, can run it back to 2019. Arjun, I'm going to leave that to your discretion as to whether you choose to do that with your limited time. We cannot do it for college because one of the stats that we used for creation is not available for college. So that is a physical limitation. So you won't see it for like draft prospects. We might run it back to 2019 because that's how long that stat existed for. And we will probably run some of this next year. We will again use it in the bootleg summer series. But that's kind of it for now. There's not sort of any, next big beta release for QBS QBDD. It's out there. Started a conversation. We can use it. We can refer to it. We can run numbers for it next year and go from there. But that's kind of it. You got anything else on that?
No, I think you covered it. We'll try to get it back to 2019, see if we want to put any of that out there. But yeah, other than that, I think it was a great hour. Enjoyed all the questions and excited to interact with more of you guys in the future, hopefully.
Yeah. And there'll be lots of opportunities for those of you that don't know. Arjun is still in college. He is not going to be in college for long. And when he is out of college, he is not going to be unemployed for long. Let's put it that way. He's going to be doing this work professionally, either for a team or the league or somebody else. But he is extremely good at this stuff. So you will see him around. He is not going to disappear anytime soon, unless, of course, somebody puts him behind a paywall. We hope that doesn't happen. But very, very thankful for his support. Everybody else that chipped in on this. I want to give a big shout out to Autumn, one of our editors that we use over on Bootleg. I contracted with her to be able to do the opening video that you all saw on the tweet. Fantastic work by her. I gave her very little direction and said, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I did the voiceover and said, make it work. She did. It was beautiful. And you can see that in the response. To Alex Katzen, who did the QBDD graph and the updates on very, very small amounts of sleep and very short notice. So big shout out to Alex. I think that's the way he actually works best. But yes, we did put him in that situation. And for all of you, really, for engaging with this, for making it real, for giving it life, for showing up, for asking questions, for challenging our assumptions and poking holes and say, hey, that doesn't look right. This really has life because of all of you. So thank you very much for all that. With that, we're going to hop out. Hawkeyes, big thanks to Hawkeyes. He's in the comments. He was our comment sheriff for today. Really appreciate that. Long time, both film room and bootleg viewer. Everybody kind of coming together to make this happen. That's all I got, but thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Yep. See you guys.